They say the truth will set you free, but they never mention that first. It will tear you apart from the inside. They don't tell you that truth is a merciless fire, burning away every lie you once held dear, leaving you shivering in the cold, naked reality of what was. And for some, silence is not a sign of weakness, but a shield, the final, desperate sacrifice to protect the ones they love from the cruelty of that very fire. In the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in New York, where crystal chandeliers dripped light like frozen tears onto the city's elite, this silence was about to be mistaken for guilt. The event was the 30th anniversary of the Davenport Corporation, an empire built on steel, strategy, and the legend of a man named Richard Davenport. Tonight, however, the spotlight belonged to his widow, Eleanor. From the stage, she looked ethereal, a figure carved from ivory and sorrow, her silver-gray dress shimmering under the soft lights. Her voice, calm and measured, flowed through the microphone, a melody of polite gratitude and corporate platitudes. She spoke of legacy, of a future built on a strong foundation, but her eyes held a distant, haunting emptiness that few ever bothered to understand. They saw a cold queen on a lonely throne. As the polite applause began, a sharp, discordant energy cut through the room. Leo Davenport, the sole heir, the golden son, was walking towards the stage. He was the very image of his father, handsome, confident, with a jawline that seemed carved for magazine covers. But tonight, his face was a mask of cold fury, his blue eyes burning with a righteous fire. He didn't wait for an invitation. He ascended the stairs, took the microphone from his mother's unresisting hand, and the room fell into a stunned silence. He turned to face the crowd, but his words were daggers aimed at only one person. For 5 years, his voice boomed, sharp and clear. "We have mourned a great man, my father. We have spoken of his genius, his integrity. But we have not spoken of how he died, or why." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Then he turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Eleanor. "My father gave you a name, a life, a kingdom, and you betrayed him. You bled his company, you broke his heart, and you pushed him into the darkness that took him from us." The air grew thin, suffocating. Then came the final blow, a whisper that was louder than a scream, a sentence that would echo for years to come. "He gave you everything, and you destroyed him. I hate you." A collective gasp rippled through the audience, but Eleanor did not flinch. She did not cry, or rage, or defend herself. She simply stood there, absorbing the hatred of her own son, and in her eyes there was not the indignation of the accused, but the profound, weary sorrow of a guardian who had just watched her most protected secret detonate. She was looking not at the man who had just condemned her, but at the lost, hurting boy inside, a boy she had shielded from a truth far more terrible than the lie he now believed. Her stillness was not an admission of guilt. It was the calm at the eye of a hurricane she had been living in for years. The ride home from the gala was a masterclass in silence. It was a heavy, suffocating thing that filled the cavernous interior of the Rolls-Royce, pressing down on the plush leather seats and the thick, soundproofed glass. Leo sat opposite his mother, the city lights of New York streaking across his face, illuminating the hard, unforgiving lines of his jaw. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the window, on a world that seemed to be moving on, oblivious to the earthquake that had just ripped through his own. He had thrown a grenade into the heart of their gilded world, and now, in the aftermath, the quiet was more deafening than the explosion itself. Eleanor, for her part, sat with a preternatural stillness, her hands resting in her lap, her posture perfect. She was not looking at Leo either, but straight ahead, as if she could see the road through the driver's partition, as if she were navigating a path only she knew. To Leo, this composure was not a sign of strength. It was the final, damning piece of evidence. It was the icy calm of a person who felt nothing, a woman who could watch a family burn and not even have the decency to show a flicker of ash in her eyes. To understand Leo's fury, you have to understand the portrait that hung in the halls of his mind, a portrait of his father, Richard Davenport. For 20 years, Leo had studied this masterpiece until he knew every brushstroke by heart. Richard was not just a man, he was an ideal, a colossus of industry, and a paragon of fatherhood. Leo's memories were a curated gallery of perfection. He remembered his father's laugh, a deep, booming sound that could fill their cavernous Upper East Side mansion with warmth. He remembered his father teaching him how to tie a Windsor knot, his large, capable hands patiently guiding Leo's small, clumsy ones. He remembered Richard on the cover of Forbes, his smile radiating a confidence that seemed capable of bending the world to his will. In Leo's world, Richard Davenport was the sun, and everyone else, including Leo himself, was just a planet caught in his glorious orbit. Then, 5 years ago, the sun had been extinguished. The official story, the one whispered at the funeral and etched into the family's public history, was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Richard Davenport, the Titan, had taken his own life. The reason, they said, was betrayal. This narrative was not born from gossip. It was meticulously crafted, its chief architect being the family's formidable matriarch, Beatrice Davenport, Richard's mother. Beatrice was a woman forged from old money and unbending will, a matriarch who ruled her family with a velvet glove that concealed a fist of iron. From the moment Eleanor, a woman from a respectable but unremarkable background, had married her princely son, Beatrice had viewed her as a hostile takeover. She saw Eleanor's quiet intelligence not as a virtue, but as cunning. She saw her grace not as elegance, but as a performance. In the raw, vulnerable days following Richard's death, Beatrice had found her most fertile ground in Leo's grief. She became his shadow, his confidant, his historian. It was she who had filled in the blanks, who had painted the final, bloody strokes onto the portrait of the past. She would sit with Leo in the dark, wood-paneled library, a glass of sherry in her hand, her voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Your father was a saint, Leo," she would say, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, but he was too trusting. He gave his heart completely, and she saw it as a commodity. She spun a tale of chilling detail. She spoke of Eleanor's affair with a corporate rival, a story embellished with hushed phone calls and secret meetings. She produced evidence, a hotel receipt she claimed to have found, a piece of jewelry she swore she'd never seen before. But the masterstroke was her explanation for the company's sudden, catastrophic downturn just before Richard's death. "She sold him out, my boy," Beatrice had whispered, her voice cracking with feigned emotion. "She sat on the board, your father's most trusted advisor, and she sold a controlling interest to his enemies. He was ruined. He couldn't bear the shame of losing the empire he built. She killed him just as surely as if she'd held a gun to his head." This story became Leo's gospel. It explained everything. It explained his mother's coldness, her distance, her lack of visible grief. Of course, she didn't cry. She was guilty. It explained why his heroic father would do something so unthinkable. He wasn't weak. He was heartbroken, a king betrayed by his queen. This narrative gave his pain a target, and for 5 years, he had aimed all of it at his mother. Every charity event she chaired was an act of hypocrisy. Every calm, measured piece of advice she offered was a manipulative ploy. He lived in the same house with her, ate at the same table, but they were separated by a chasm of his own making, a chasm dug and shaped by his grandmother's careful, poisonous words. And so, as the Rolls-Royce finally glided to a stop before their limestone mansion, Leo exited the car without a backward glance, leaving his mother to emerge alone into the cool night air. Inside, the house was just as silent as the car had been. It was less a home than a mausoleum, a monument to a man who was no longer there. A larger-than-life portrait of Richard hung in the grand foyer, his painted eyes seeming to follow them with an air of noble disappointment. Later that night, Beatrice found Leo in his father's study, a room he had preserved exactly as it was 5 years ago. He was staring at the empty leather chair behind the mahogany desk, a ghost sitting where a god once did. Beatrice placed a withered, bejeweled hand on his shoulder. "You did what you had to do, Leo," she said softly. "You spoke the truth. Your father would be proud." She didn't need to say anything more. Her words were the final turn of the key in a lock she had forged long ago. She reinforced his conviction, validated his hatred, and sanctified his public cruelty as an act of love and loyalty. He looked up at his grandmother, his eyes filled with a grim determination. In his mind, the battle lines were clearly drawn. It was him and his grandmother, the Loyalists, against the usurper who slept just one floor above. He was the son of Richard Davenport, and he would spend the rest of his life protecting that legacy. He would take control, he would purge the company of his mother's lingering influence, and he would rebuild the kingdom she had so mercilessly tried to tear down. He felt a surge of purpose, a clarity that was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. He was his father's son, and his war had just begun. The day after the gala, Leo Davenport walked into the headquarters of the Davenport Corporation, not as an heir in waiting, but as a king claiming his throne. The whispers followed him down the marble hallways, the shocked and curious stares of employees peeling away as he approached. He ignored them. He strode into the top-floor executive suite, a sprawling space of glass and steel overlooking Central Park, a throne room that had been his father's domain. It had been largely unoccupied for 5 years, a corporate memorial that everyone was too intimidated to touch. Leo, however, felt no such hesitation. He was not there to mourn. He was there to resurrect. Flanked by his grandmother Beatrice, who moved with the silent, predatory grace of a panther, he convened an emergency meeting of the board. His speech was brief, cold, and surgical. He spoke of a new era, a return to the founding principles of integrity and strength that had been the bedrock of his father's vision. He announced a comprehensive, top-to-bottom audit of the last 7 years of the company's operations. He didn't need to mention his mother's name. The implication hung in the air, thick and heavy. The audit, he declared, was to identify and rectify any and all strategic missteps that had weakened the company's position. It was a thinly veiled witch hunt, and everyone in the room knew who the intended witch was. Beatrice sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a silent, smiling statue of approval. Her presence was all the endorsement Leo needed. The board, a collection of men who owed their careers to either Richard or Beatrice, quickly and unanimously fell in line. The kingdom was his. Leo threw himself into the work with the fervor of a zealot. He wanted to understand the full scope of his mother's alleged treachery. Night after night, the lights of his father's office burned late, casting a solitary beacon of light against the New York skyline. Surrounded by stacks of financial ledgers, acquisition reports, and shareholder statements, he began his archaeological dig into the company's recent past. He was searching for the fault lines of his mother's betrayal, the specific transaction where she had sold the critical shares his grandmother spoke of. He wanted to see it in black and white, to possess the irrefutable proof that would justify the venom in his heart. But the past is a stubborn, complicated thing. It does not always yield the treasures you seek. For weeks, Leo found nothing. Frustration began to gnaw at him. The numbers and reports from the last 5 years, a period where Eleanor had a quiet but significant say on the board as a major shareholder, showed a period of conservative, steady, albeit slow, growth. It was a strategy of stabilization, not sabotage. Annoyed, he pushed his search further back into the final 2 years of his father's life, determined to find the seeds of the decay his grandmother had described. And that is when he found the first crack. It wasn't a canyon, just a hairline fracture in the marble facade of his father's legend. It was a subsidiary company he'd never heard of, Phoenix Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. According to the internal ledgers, the Davenport Corporation had invested over $50 million into it. Yet, there were no business plans, no quarterly reports, no record of Phoenix Holdings ever producing a single dollar of revenue. It was a ghost, a black hole that had swallowed a fortune. Leo's first instinct was a jolt of triumph. This was it. This had to be his mother's doing, a shell corporation she had set up to siphon money. But his triumph curdled in his throat when he saw the authorization codes and the signatures on the wire transfers. They were all Richard Davenport's. Unease settled in his stomach. He kept digging, pulling the records for his father's personal trading accounts, assets managed by the company, as was his executive privilege. He expected to see the portfolio of a genius blue-chip stocks, wise bonds, the steady, patient accumulation of wealth. Instead, he found a bloodbath of high-risk ventures, speculative biotech firms that had gone bankrupt, volatile foreign currencies, Options trading that looked less like a strategy and more like a desperate gambler throwing dice against a loaded wall. A cold confusion began to seep into the edges of his anger. This didn't make sense. His father was a brilliant strategist, a man who famously preached fiscal discipline. He would have never made such reckless, amateurish bets. Leo's mind scrambled for an explanation that would keep his world from tilting on its axis. Had his father been ill? Was his judgment impaired? Or was this also Eleanor's fault? Perhaps she had pushed him into it, her incessant demands for more, forcing him to take bigger and bigger risks. Yes, that had to be it. Beatrice's words came echoing back to him. Her ambition was a sickness. He seized onto this explanation, clinging to it like a life raft. He had found the evidence, he told himself, not of his father's weakness, but of his mother's corrosive influence. That evening, he went looking for her. He found her in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with orchids, her one personal indulgence. She was tending to a rare white bloom, her movements slow and deliberate. Leo didn't bother with pleasantries. He threw a thin file containing the Phoenix Holdings transfers onto a nearby wrought iron table. The sound made her flinch, but she didn't turn around immediately. "I spent the last 2 weeks looking for your fingerprints on the company's decline," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "But I see now, your methods were far more subtle. Tell me about Phoenix Holdings. Was this one of your projects? Another way to bleed him dry before you delivered the final blow?" Eleanor slowly turned to face him. Her eyes drifted to the file, and a flicker of something recognition, pain, resignation passed through them before her calm mask was back in place. She looked at him, her gaze so direct and unwavering that he felt an uncomfortable urge to look away. "What do you think you found, Leo?" she asked, her voice quiet, devoid of the panic or outrage he had expected. "I found the truth," he shot back. "I found how you pushed him, how you forced him into desperation." She took a small step closer, her eyes searching his. And then she delivered the words that would become a splinter in his mind. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You found a piece of a puzzle you don't know how to solve. Your father wasn't the man you think he was." She paused, letting the heresy of that statement hang in the air between them. "And sometimes, Leo, numbers don't lie. They don't have agendas or fragile egos. They just are." Her calm, her refusal to fight, was more infuriating than any denial. She was dismissing him, treating his righteous anger like a childish tantrum. "If you truly want to understand your father's legacy," she continued, "you have to be willing to look at all of it, not just the shining parts you've polished in your memory." Rage, pure and hot, flooded Leo's senses. She was deflecting, slandering a dead man to cover her own tracks. It was the most cowardly, despicable thing he had ever witnessed. "Don't you dare," he seethed, his finger jabbing at the file. "Don't you dare tarnish his name to excuse what you did." He snatched the file from the table and stormed out of the conservatory, the scent of orchids and lies clinging to him. He was more certain than ever of her guilt. But as he sat in his father's study late that night, the file sitting on the edge of the desk, her words echoed in the silence. Numbers don't lie. The certainty he had felt just hours before was now polluted by a tiny, poisonous drop of doubt. He had looked for a monster and found a mystery instead, and for the first time, he was afraid of what the answer might be. After Leo had stormed from the conservatory, leaving the scent of his rage lingering among the orchids, Eleanor did not move for a very long time. She stood in the humid silence, the ghost of his words. "Don't you dare tarnish his name," echoing in the glass enclosure. A profound sadness settled over her, a familiar cloak she had worn for 5 long years. She felt no anger towards him. How could she? He was a soldier fighting a war with a map drawn by the enemy, fiercely defending a flag he didn't know was a forgery. Beatrice had done her work too well, building a fortress of lies around Leo's heart, brick by painful brick. Eleanor knew that any truth she spoke would simply shatter against those walls. Words were useless now. The truth could not be given. It had to be discovered. He had to undertake the journey himself, to follow the breadcrumbs through the dark forest of the past until he reached the ghastly gingerbread house at the center of it all. Her quiet, lonely war, was now entering a new phase. For 5 years, she had been on the defensive, a silent shield absorbing blows meant for the memory of a broken man and for the soul of her own child. Now, it was time to play offense, but her methods were not those of Beatrice, all daggers and poison. Eleanor's strategy was one of light, a single, well-placed candle in a vast, dark room. That evening, she went to her private study, a room Leo rarely entered, and knelt before a large, ornate bookcase. She ran her fingers along the spines of leather-bound classics until she found it, a worn copy of Moby Dick. She pulled it from the shelf, and instead of a book, the cover opened to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was an old, heavy key. It was not a modern key of serrated steel, but a piece of ornate, tarnished brass, with a complex, almost floral-patterned head and a long, cylindrical shaft. It was a key from another time, a key that promised to unlock more than just a simple door. The next morning, a plain, padded manila envelope arrived by messenger at Leo's office in the Davenport Tower. It had no return address, and the label was typed in a nondescript font. Leo, immersed in quarterly reports and battling the lingering unease from his discovery, opened it with dismissive impatience, assuming it was some unsolicited proposal. His fingers, however, closed not on paper, but on a hard, cold object. He tipped the contents onto his gleaming mahogany desk. The old brass key slid out, followed by a small, crisp rectangle of paper with a single typed line, an address in Long Island City, Queens. It was a part of the city synonymous with warehouses, industrial lots, and the gritty, unglamorous work that kept Manhattan shining. It was not a place a Davenport ever had reason to go. His mind immediately began to race. What was this? A prank? Some bizarre marketing ploy? Or was it something more sinister? His recent public declaration of war on his mother had made him a target. Perhaps this was a threat from an old family enemy, or even a message from one of the shadowy figures connected to his father's reckless investments. He examined the key, its weight unfamiliar in his palm. It felt ancient, secret. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime of privilege and security protocols, told him to have his security team investigate it, to dispose of it, to treat it as a potential threat. He almost did. He almost swept it into the trash can, dismissing it as a dangerous distraction. But then, his mother's words echoed in his head. Numbers don't lie. The numbers he had found, the $50 million vanished into Phoenix Holdings. The ruinous personal trades were a mystery that his grandmother's neat, tidy narrative could not explain. This key, this address, it felt like a loose thread connected to that same mystery. The desire to pull on it, to see what might unravel, became an obsession that gnawed at his carefully constructed certainty. Miles away, in a sun-drenched study in a quiet Connecticut town, the phone rang. James Henderson, a man in his late 70s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who has seen the very worst of human nature, picked up the receiver. He had been Richard Davenport's personal lawyer, mentor, and, for a time, his only friend. He had retired abruptly, almost scandalously so, a week after Richard's funeral, cutting all ties with the family and the firm he had helped build. "James, it's Eleanor," the voice on the other end said, as calm and clear as he remembered. Henderson took a slow breath. He had been waiting for this call for 5 years. "Eleanor," he replied, his voice warm. "I was wondering when you might call." "I've sent him the key," she said, without preamble. "He's starting to look into the numbers." He found Phoenix Holdings. A small, sad smile touched Henderson's lips. "Ah, the first crack in the dam," he murmured. "Is he ready for what he's going to find?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Eleanor spoke again, her voice was laced with a mother's pain. "No," she said softly. "He is nowhere near ready, but he is starting to question. He is finally looking for answers instead of just accepting the story he was told. That is all I can hope for right now. He may come to you, James." "My door is always open," Henderson assured her. "I'll be ready. I've kept the files, just as you asked. Everything is safe." "Thank you, James," Eleanor said, a world of gratitude contained in those 3 simple words. "For everything." The line went dead, and Henderson sat for a moment, looking out at the autumn leaves falling in his garden. He was the keeper of the truth, the custodian of a story so ugly it had nearly destroyed them all. He had promised Eleanor he would guard it until the day her son was ready to hear it. It seemed that day was finally drawing near. Back in his sterile office, high above the city, Leo could not focus. The key on his desk seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was a question, a challenge, a dare. He told himself it was about finding more ammunition against his mother, about proving that his father had been manipulated into these strange dealings. But deep down, a different, more terrifying thought was taking root. What if his mother was telling the truth? What if his father wasn't the man he thought he was? The idea was a sacrilege, a betrayal of everything he stood for. Yet, he couldn't shake it. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the city, he made a decision. He slipped the key into his pocket. The feel of its cold, heavy weight was both a comfort and a burden. He would go to the address. He would unlock the door. He was no longer just defending his father's past. He was now a detective, stepping into a crime scene that was 2 decades old. The drive to Queens was a journey to another planet. As Leo's sleek black Mercedes crossed the Queensboro Bridge, the glittering spires of Manhattan receded in his rearview mirror, replaced by a landscape of brick, steel, and concrete. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, tasting of industry and grit. He was a foreigner here, his luxury car, an alien vessel navigating a world of delivery trucks, weathered storefronts, and elevated subway tracks that cast rhythmic, moving shadows across the streets below. He felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling of trespassing not just on property, but on a reality he had been insulated from his entire life. The address led him to a hulking, soot-stained brick warehouse that took up half a city block, its windows clouded with decades of grime. A faded sign above a rolling steel gate read Sentinel Storage. This was not a place for treasured family heirlooms. This was a place where things went to be forgotten. The inside was even grimmer. The air was cool and smelled of damp concrete and dust. A single, bored-looking attendant sat behind a scratched pane of plexiglass, barely glancing up from his tabloid newspaper as Leo stated the unit number. He was handed a clipboard to sign, his elegant signature looking absurdly out of place on the smudged form. He was directed to a freight elevator that groaned and shuddered its way to the 4th floor. The hallway was a long, dim corridor, lit by fluorescent bulbs that hummed and flickered overhead. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of his own expensive shoes on the dusty floor. It felt like a catacomb, a modern tomb for the unwanted possessions of a million lives. He found the unit, number 413, and his hand trembled slightly as he slid the old brass key into the lock. It turned with a stiff, grinding reluctance, and the heavy metal door groaned open, revealing a cavern of absolute darkness. He fumbled for his phone, its powerful flashlight cutting a sharp beam through the black. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was the scent of a sealed room, of stale air and old paper, but underneath it were the ghosts of other aromas, the faint, sweet scent of aged whiskey and the acrid tang of cold cigar smoke. This was not just a storage space. He found a light switch by the door, and with a loud click, a single bare bulb sputtered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the scene. His breath caught in his throat. The unit was not filled with boxes and furniture. It was an office, a small, secret, desperate-looking office. A worn mahogany desk was pushed against the far wall, its surface littered with papers. A threadbare leather chair sat before it, its back to the door. A cheap metal filing cabinet stood in one corner, and a corkboard, covered in a chaotic collage of notes and clippings, hung on the wall. It was the den of a man in hiding, a man running from something. It was the antithesis of his father's grand, orderly office downtown. Hesitantly, Leo stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a clang that echoed in the silence. He ran a hand over the dusty desk. He was standing in a secret chapter of his father's life. He didn't know where to start. His eyes fell on the filing cabinet. It was unlocked. The top drawer was filled with bank statements, but not from the prestigious institutions the Davenports used. These were from small, regional banks in places like Atlantic City and Las Vegas. He pulled one out. It showed a series of massive cash withdrawals, one after another, depleting a multi-million-dollar account in a matter of weeks. His heart began to beat faster. In the back of the same drawer, he found a bundle of letters, tied with a faded silk ribbon. The handwriting was feminine, elegant but rushed. He untied the ribbon. The letters were signed, Isabella. He began to read, expecting to find the passionate words of a secret love affair. But the tone was not of passion. It was of exhaustion and fear. "Richard, you promised me you would stop. I saw the papers. You're using the Phoenix account again. She will find out, my love. You know she will. Your mother sees everything." Another letter, dated a week later. "He came looking for you again. The man with the scarred face. He said you have until Friday. Richard, this is not a game. These are not your boardroom rivals. These are dangerous people. Please, just talk to your mother. Beg her if you have to. It's the only way." Leo felt a wave of nausea. His father wasn't having a torrid affair with a femme fatale. He was hiding with a terrified woman, running from loan sharks, and apparently cowering in fear of his own mother, Beatrice. The image of the powerful patriarch, the king of his own destiny, was cracking and splintering with every word he read. He moved to the desk, his movements numb and robotic. He pulled open the main drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of old Wall Street journals, were the casino markers, IOUs, dozens of them. Not from glamorous Vegas casinos, but from underground clubs and backroom poker games, places whose names were scrawled in nearly illegible script. The amounts were astronomical, promises of payment that his father had clearly failed to honor. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a rich man's dalliance. This was a disease. A ravenous addiction that had consumed his father from the inside out. The final blow came from a locked leather briefcase tucked under the desk. He had to force the latch with a letter opener. It snapped open with a sharp crack. Inside, there was no money, no precious objects. There was only a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. He opened it. The neat columns and familiar looping handwriting were his father's. The title at the top of the first page read, "Phoenix Holdings, 2 private accounts." It was all there. A meticulous, secret record of his ruin. He saw the initial $50 million investment from the Davenport Corporation, listed as seed capital. And then he saw how that seed had been squandered. Entry after entry detailed catastrophic losses: a horse race in Saratoga, a baccarat game in Macau, a series of disastrous stock market bets made on pure, desperate impulse. He was using company funds as his personal ATM to chase his gambling losses, funneling it through the shell corporation to hide the truth from the board, from his family, from the world. Leo sank to his knees, the heavy ledger falling open on the floor in front of him. The single bulb overhead hummed, illuminating the swirling dust motes and the devastating, undeniable truth written in his own father's hand. The fortress of lies crumbled, and the dust filled his lungs, choking him. Richard the Saint was dead. In his place was Richard the addict, Richard the liar, Richard the thief. A weak man, terrified of his own mother, who had secretly dismantled his own empire. The hatred he had nursed for his mother for 5 years evaporated in an instant, replaced by a vast, cold, horrifying emptiness. He had been a fool. He had been his grandmother's puppet dancing on the strings of a story that was not just a lie, but a cruel and total inversion of the truth. He leaned his head against the cold metal of the filing cabinet, and finally, for the first time since he was a small boy, Leo Davenport began to weep. He wasn't crying for the father he had lost, but for the father who had never existed at all. Leo returned from the storage unit a changed man. The fiery, righteous anger that had been his fuel for 5 years had been extinguished, leaving behind a cold, hollow shell. He moved through the Davenport mansion like a ghost, his eyes vacant, his presence diminished. He stopped his crusade at the office, the audit paperwork sitting untouched on his desk. At the dinner table, the tense, combative silence of the past was replaced by a different kind of quiet, the unnerving stillness of a man lost in a fog of his own thoughts. He no longer looked at his mother with open contempt. He barely looked at her at all. He was adrift in a sea of shattered certainties, and the one person who noticed the change in the tides was the one who had the most to lose from it, Beatrice Davenport. Beatrice was a predator of the highest order, and she could smell the scent of uncertainty on her grandson like blood in the water. She watched him for 2 days, her sharp, intelligent eyes missing nothing. She saw the way he stared into space, the way he flinched at the mention of his father's name, the way he now avoided her gaze as much as he avoided his mother's. She did not know what he had found, but she knew he had found something. The narrative she had so carefully constructed was under threat. The fortress was breached. And so, the master manipulator prepared to do what she did best, shore up the walls by weaving a new, more intricate lie, a lie that would incorporate the very truth he had discovered. She chose her moment perfectly. It was late, past midnight, and Leo was where he always was now, sitting in the dark in his father's study, the amber glow of a single desk lamp illuminating his tormented face. She entered without knocking, carrying a small silver tray with 2 crystal glasses and a decanter of Richard's favorite single malt scotch. She moved with a practiced, silent grace, her presence both commanding and comforting. "You look so much like him when you're troubled," she said, her voice a soft, velvety murmur. She poured 2 glasses, placing one by his hand. He used to sit in this very chair, in this very light, wrestling with the burdens of an empire. "I see the same weight on your shoulders now." Leo didn't respond, merely staring into the golden liquid. Beatrice settled into the leather armchair opposite him, the picture of grandmotherly concern. "I have not been entirely honest with you, Leo," she began, her voice catching with a perfectly timed tremor of emotion. This got his attention. He looked up, his eyes wary. Beatrice leaned forward, her face a mask of pained confession. "I have spent 5 years trying to protect you, trying to protect his memory, but in doing so, I see now that I have left you to fight a battle without all the facts. I told you your mother's betrayal destroyed him. That is the truth. But it is not the whole truth." She took a delicate sip of her scotch, her eyes shining under the lamplight. "Your father, he was a genius, a brilliant, shining star. But even the brightest stars have their darkness. He had a weakness, a thirst for risk that he usually channeled into the business. But after he discovered Eleanor's affair, after she broke his heart so completely, that need for risk soured. It became something else, something darker." She let the word hang in the air. "He started gambling, Leo." Leo flinched as if he'd been struck. She saw it and knew she was on the right path. "It started small," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A poker game here, a horse race there. He was trying to feel something, anything, other than the pain of her betrayal. He was a man drowning, and the casino was the only air he could find. I tried to help him, to reason with him, but he was lost in his grief." Here came the masterstroke. She looked Leo directly in the eye, her own gaze filled with a concoction of sorrow and fury. "And then, your mother found out. She found his markers. She learned about his debts. And a normal woman, a loving wife, would have helped him. She would have stood by him, fought for him, but not Eleanor." Beatrice's voice turned to ice. She saw his weakness not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. It became her leverage, her weapon. She blackmailed him, Leo. Every time she wanted more control, a seat on a new committee, more of the company's money for one of her ridiculous charities, she would hold his debts over his head. She threatened to expose him to the board, to ruin him completely. The more she took, the more desperate he became, and the more he gambled, trying to win back enough to pay her off, to get her off his back. She didn't just break his heart, my boy. She took his soul, piece by piece, and sold it for a better position in society. The story was a work of art, a tapestry of deceit woven with threads of truth. It acknowledged the gambling, the debts, the secret life, all the ugly facts Leo had discovered in that dusty room. But it brilliantly reframed them, recasting his father not as a weak, addicted man running from his own demons, but as a tragic, heartbroken hero, driven to desperation by the machinations of a cruel, vampiric wife. It gave Leo a narrative that his wounded heart desperately wanted to believe. It was easier to accept a father who was a victim than a father who was a fraud. Beatrice reached across the desk and placed her cold, dry hand over his. "I am sorry," she whispered, a single, perfect tear tracing a path down her powdered cheek. "I did not tell you this because I couldn't bear for you to think of your father as anything less than the lion he was. He was a great man, brought low by a devastating betrayal. Please, forgive me for trying to shield you from the ugliest parts of the story." Leo was silent. His mind was a battlefield, the ugly, chaotic truth from the storage unit clashing with this new, elegant, tragic narrative from his grandmother. The latter was simpler, it was cleaner. It restored a semblance of honor to his father, and, most importantly, it reaffirmed the target for his pain and confusion. The image of his mother, not as a silent sufferer, but as a cold, calculating predator, exploiting her husband's addiction, began to form in his mind. It was a monstrous image, but it made a terrible kind of sense. It explained everything. He looked at his grandmother, this pillar of strength who was bearing her soul for him, and felt a surge of familiar loyalty. She had protected him. She had always protected him. He slowly wrapped his own hand around hers, his grip tight. The crack in the dam had not been sealed, but Beatrice had expertly diverted the floodwaters, channeling them right back toward the woman in the room upstairs. The web was not broken, it had just been reinforced with steel. Beatrice's revised narrative was a powerful anesthetic, dulling the sharp, searing pain of the truth Leo had discovered in the storage unit. But like any drug, its effects began to wear off, and in the quiet moments, the haunting reality would resurface. He found himself trapped in a mental labyrinth, wandering between two conflicting versions of the past. In one hallway, he saw his father as his grandmother had painted him, a noble king, heartbroken and driven to desperation by a treacherous queen. In another, he saw the grim evidence from the dusty room, the frantic letters from Isabella, the mountain of sordid debts, the secret ledger written in his father's own hand. The timelines didn't quite match. The sheer volume of debt seemed too vast to have been accumulated in the short time after his mother's alleged affair. A small, persistent voice in the back of his mind kept whispering that something was still profoundly wrong. His grandmother's story was a comfort, but it was a borrowed comfort, and it felt increasingly fragile. He needed something solid, something objective. And in his desperation, a name from the past surfaced in his memory: James Henderson, Mr. Henderson had been the family's chief counsel for 30 years. A man of quiet dignity and unimpeachable integrity. He wasn't just an employee, he had been Richard's mentor and, Leo suspected, his conscience. Henderson had a unique quality within the Davenport orbit. He was beholden to no one. He treated Beatrice with professional respect, not the fearful reverence she usually commanded. He had always been kind and courteous to Eleanor, even when the family's chill towards her was at its most severe. He was a man of facts and laws, not of drama and intrigue. He was neutral ground. Leo decided, under the pretext of clarifying some legal details of his inheritance, that he would pay the old lawyer a visit. It was a pilgrimage in search of an oracle. The drive to Henderson's home in rural Connecticut was a balm to his frayed nerves. He left the oppressive stone and steel of the city behind, following winding country roads flanked by trees ablaze in autumn colors. Henderson lived in a modest, beautiful old colonial house, surrounded by sprawling gardens and ancient oak trees. The air here was clean, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves. It was a world away from the toxic, pressurized atmosphere of the Davenport mansion. When Henderson opened the door, he looked older, his face lined with the wisdom of age, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as ever. He greeted Leo with a warm, genuine smile, showing no surprise at the unexpected visit. He led him into a cozy study, where a fire crackled in the hearth and the walls were lined, floor to ceiling, with books. It was the room of a man who valued knowledge over power. Leo, feeling suddenly like an awkward schoolboy, began with his fabricated excuse, asking some perfunctory questions about trust management. Henderson answered them patiently, then leaned back in his worn leather chair, his fingers steepled. "That's the official business, I assume," he said, his tone gentle but direct. "But you didn't drive 2 hours to ask me questions your accountants could have answered in 5 minutes." What's really on your mind, son? The directness disarmed Leo. The pretense fell away, and he found himself speaking, his voice low and uncertain. He didn't tell Henderson about the storage unit, but he recounted the story his grandmother had told him, the story of his father's gambling being a direct result of Eleanor's affair and subsequent blackmail. He laid it all out, needing the wise old man to validate it, to confirm that this tragic but noble version of his father was the true one. Henderson listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Leo finished, the lawyer was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire. "That is a powerful story," Henderson said finally, his voice soft. "It has a villain, a victim, and a terrible, tragic ending. It makes a certain kind of emotional sense." He turned his gaze to Leo. "But emotion is not a fact, Leo. And memory, especially when shaped by grief, can be an unreliable narrator. Let's look at some facts, shall we?" He rose slowly and went to an old wooden filing cabinet. He pulled out a thick, dust-covered file marked Davenport, Richard, Estate Planning. He laid it on the desk and opened it. "This," he said, pointing to a document yellowed with age, "is the original marital trust your father and I drafted when he first married your mother. I want you to read Article 4. Leo leaned forward. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. In the event of Richard's death or incapacitation, Eleanor was to be granted sole trusteeship over his entire voting share block in the company. It gave her absolute control. "This was written 26 years ago," Henderson said quietly. "This is the signature of a young man deeply in love, who trusted his wife so completely that he was willing to place his entire legacy in her hands. That is a fact. Your grandmother, of course, spent the next decade convincing him to amend this with so many clauses and conditions that it became almost meaningless. But this is where he started. This was his truth then." Leo felt a chill. This document was a testament to a love and trust he had never been told about. Henderson wasn't finished. "You mentioned the gambling began after the affair," he continued, as if discussing a simple point of law. "The timeline is the most stubborn fact of all, isn't it?" He walked over to his bookshelf and pulled down a series of old, leather-bound appointment diaries. He flipped through the pages of one from 7 years prior. "I used to have to arrange your father's retreats. He was a very private man. He called them strategic planning sessions. Here is one, March, 7 years ago. A 2-week stay at a very private wellness center in Arizona, the Sonoran Renewal Clinic. Here's another, the year before that, the Pacific Serenity Institute in California." He slid a piece of paper and a pen across the desk. "You have a phone. Look them up. See what they specialize in." He paused, his eyes full of a deep sadness. "The problems with your mother, if my memory serves, didn't begin until a year or two after that. The timeline, as you can see, doesn't quite fit the story you've been told." Leo felt the floor drop out from under him. The gambling hadn't been the result of the affair. It had predated it by years. The affair hadn't been the cause. It had merely been another symptom of a man who was already falling apart. Finally, Henderson sat back down. "Leo," he said, his voice imbued with a heavy gravity, "your grandmother is one of the most brilliant and formidable women I have ever met. She loves you, and she loved your father. But more than anything, she loves the Davenport name, the legacy. She believes it is a living entity that must be protected at all costs. I once heard her say that history is not what happens, it's the story we agree to tell. She is a master storyteller, and she has been telling this particular story for a very, very long time." Leo left Henderson's house an hour later, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting facts. He drove for a few miles before pulling over onto the shoulder of a quiet country road, the autumn leaves drifting down around his car like silent, falling embers. He felt no anger, no sorrow, just a profound and terrifying clarity. He had been lied to, not by omission, but by design. Henderson hadn't given him a new story. He had simply given him the tools to dismantle the old one. He took out his phone, his fingers shaking slightly, and typed Sonoran Renewal Clinic into the search bar. The results loaded instantly. The clinic was a world-renowned, ultra-exclusive treatment facility for addiction. Its specialty, listed right on the homepage, was compulsive gambling. The timeline was a fact. The trust document was a fact. His grandmother's story was a carefully crafted fiction, and if she had lied about this, what else had she lied about? For the first time, Leo was no longer a son defending his father's honor. He was an investigator, and his chief suspect was the woman he had trusted most in the world. Armed with facts that dismantled his grandmother's timeline, Leo was no longer stumbling in the dark. He was on a hunt. His next target was the ghost at the center of the mystery, Isabella, the name from the letters in the storage unit. He hired a private investigator, a discreet professional recommended by Henderson, and gave him a simple task: find her. The investigator was efficient. Within a week, the ghost had a name and a location. She was no longer Isabella Lacrosse, the aspiring actress whose face had graced a few minor magazine editorials 2 decades ago. She was now Sarah Peterson, a high school drama teacher in a quiet, leafy suburb in New Jersey. She was married, had a teenage son, and lived a life of PTA meetings and picket fences. The femme fatale, who had supposedly brought down the Davenport Empire, was now directing a student production of Our Town. Leo drove to the town on a crisp autumn afternoon. The setting was so aggressively normal, it felt surreal. He parked across the street from the local high school and waited. When the final bell rang, he saw her. She was older, of course, her fiery red hair now a more subdued auburn, with fine lines around her eyes and mouth, but it was unmistakably her. She carried a tote bag, overflowing with scripts, and looked more like a tired teacher than a homewrecker. He got out of the car and approached her as she walked toward the faculty parking lot. "Isabella?" he asked, his voice quiet. The woman froze. The name was a key, unlocking a door to a past she had sealed shut long ago. Fear, stark and immediate, flashed in her eyes. She saw his face, the uncanny resemblance to Richard, and she took a step back. "You have the wrong person," she stammered, turning to walk away. "Please," Leo said, his voice pleading, not threatening. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm Richard's son. I need to understand what happened." "There's nothing to understand," she said, her voice trembling. "That was another life. Leave me alone." He had to stop her. He had to prove he wasn't his grandmother's soldier. "They told me you were a predator who blackmailed my father," he said quickly. "But I found his office. I found the ledger for Phoenix Holdings. I found the letters about the men who were coming to collect. I know their story is a lie." The mention of Phoenix Holdings stopped her cold. It was a name only a handful of people in the world would know. She slowly turned back to face him, her eyes searching his for any sign of deceit. What she saw was not the arrogance of a Davenport, but the raw, desperate confusion of a son. The fight went out of her. She looked tired, her shoulders slumping with the weight of a secret she had carried for 15 years. "All right," she sighed. "Not here. There's a diner a mile down the road. I'll meet you there in 10 minutes. They sat in a worn vinyl booth in the corner of the diner, the air thick with the smell of coffee and fried onions. For a long time, Isabella or Sarah just stirred her coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. "What do you want to know?" she asked finally. "I want to know the truth," Leo said simply. "All of it." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "The truth," she repeated. "The truth is that your father was the kindest, saddest, and weakest man I have ever known. He was a little boy playing king in a castle owned by his mother." She began to talk, and as she did, the final, gilded panels of Richard Davenport's portrait fell away, revealing the rotten canvas beneath. She told Leo that she had met Richard at a charity function. He was charming, handsome, and profoundly lonely. Their affair was less a passionate romance and more a companionship of two lost souls. He wasn't a powerful man seducing a young actress. He was a broken man looking for a place to hide. "But the strangest thing," Isabella said, leaning forward, "was your grandmother, Beatrice. In the beginning, I was terrified of her. I was sure she would find out and destroy me. But she already knew. I believe she knew from the very first week. She described how strange, anonymous gifts would arrive at her apartment: an expensive bottle of perfume, a designer handbag, things she knew Richard, in his chaotic state, would never have thought to buy. It was her, Isabella said, her voice dropping. It was Beatrice. She was encouraging it. She was enabling us. Why? Leo asked, his mind struggling to process this. Why would she do that? Because I was the perfect distraction, Isabella said, her eyes hard with the clarity of hindsight. I was his shiny toy. While he was with me, flying off to secret weekends, consumed by the drama of our affair and the terror of his gambling debts, he wasn't at the office. He wasn't paying attention to the details. And that's exactly what Beatrice wanted. She didn't want him to fail. She wanted to take control. While he was busy with me, she was the one at the office, meeting with the lawyers, rewriting the terms of the family trusts, moving assets, shifting power. She was staging a silent coup, and I was her unwitting accomplice. I was the smokescreen that allowed her to dismantle her own son's empire and rebuild it in her image. The words hit Leo with the force of a physical blow. The monster wasn't his mother. It wasn't even Isabella. The monster was the woman who had kissed his forehead goodnight, who had told him stories of his father's greatness, who had meticulously crafted his entire worldview. I tried to get him to see it, Isabella continued, her voice filled with old frustration. I told him his mother was devouring him alive. I begged him to fight her, to get help, to run away with me. We could have started over. But he was terrified of her. She had been inside his head his entire life, pulling the strings. He knew what she was doing, I think, on some level. But to stand up to her would have been like a planet trying to defy the sun's gravity. It was impossible. In the end, he was too weak to save himself. And she just let him fall. The story was complete. It was a grotesque, horrifying tapestry of manipulation and betrayal. His father had not been a lion brought down by a snake. He had been a lamb, raised and fattened for slaughter by his own mother. And Eleanor, Leo felt a wave of shame so profound it almost made him sick. His mother hadn't been a cold, distant queen. She had been a prisoner of war, watching this horror unfold, trying to protect her child from the devastating truth, and in doing so, had allowed herself to become the villain in his eyes. Her silence wasn't guilt. It was a shield. He left the diner and walked numbly back to his car. The suburban street seemed to mock him with its peaceful normality. The quest for the truth, which had started with a single angry shout at a party, was over. He had found it, and it was uglier than anything he could have ever imagined. The image of his father, the saint, was gone forever, replaced by the pathetic ghost of a man he pitied, and his love for his grandmother had curdled into a cold, hard knot of hatred in his stomach. He sat in his car for a very long time, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. The investigation was over. Now, a new mission was beginning. The mission for justice. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he could not do it alone. He started the car, and for the first time in 5 years, he drove home not to fight with his mother, but to finally join her. The drive back to Manhattan was a silent, 80-minute confession. With every mile that brought him closer to the Davenport mansion, Leo felt the crushing weight of his 5-year crusade of hatred. Every cruel word he had ever spoken to his mother, every cold glance, every public humiliation, now played back in his mind, not as acts of righteous loyalty, but as the brutish, ignorant crimes they truly were. He had been a weapon in his grandmother's hands, aimed at the one person who had been trying to protect him. The skyline of the city, which had always filled him with a sense of pride and ownership, now looked like a cold, stone monument to his own foolishness. He was not returning home as a king, but as a penitent, preparing to face the person he had wronged most in the world. He entered the house through a side door, the grand foyer seeming to mock him with its opulence. The air was still and silent. He found his mother in the library, the same room where Beatrice had so expertly respun her web of lies just a short time ago. Eleanor was sitting in a high-backed chair, a book open in her lap, her face illuminated by the soft, warm glow of a reading lamp. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, her eyes revealing nothing. For a moment, Leo just stood in the doorway, a chasm of 5 years of bitterness separating them. He didn't know how to begin, how to bridge that impossible distance. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He took a breath and stepped into the room. "I went to the storage unit in Queens," he began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar to his own ears. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. "I found the second ledger, the letters, the markers." He took another step. "I went to see James Henderson. He showed me the original trust. He told me about the clinics." He was close to her now, close enough to see the flicker of a deep, ancient pain in her eyes. He delivered the final piece. "And then I found Isabella. She's a teacher in New Jersey. She told me everything, about my father and about Beatrice. She told me how my grandmother used her as a distraction." He stopped before her chair, looking down at this woman he had misunderstood so completely. He finally let go of the last shred of his pride, the final remnant of the arrogant boy he had been. He looked her in the eye, and the only 2 words in the world that mattered tumbled from his lips. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything. For all of it. I'm so sorry, Mom." The word, Mom, hung in the air, a word he hadn't used with such sincerity since he was a child. Eleanor closed her book, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not weep. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply looked up at her son, her face a portrait of immense, heartbreaking grace. She rose from her chair and, to his astonishment, she reached out and placed a cool hand on his cheek. "The truth is a heavy burden to carry alone," she said, her voice soft and steady, though her eyes were now shimmering with unshed tears. "I am just sorry you had to carry the weight of the lie for so long." In that single, selfless sentence, she forgave him. She absolved him of his 5 years of cruelty, understanding that he had been a victim as much as she had. In the quiet sanctity of the library, with the ghosts of 1,000 literary tragedies looking on, the full story was finally told. Eleanor spoke for hours, her calm voice weaving together all the disparate, ugly threads into a single, coherent tapestry. She confirmed Richard's addiction, Beatrice's terrifying, lifelong manipulation of her son. "I stayed, Leo, not because I didn't have the strength to leave, but because I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you behind," she explained. "I knew what she was. I knew what she would turn you into if I wasn't here to act as some kind of buffer, even a silent one. I chose to be your shield, even if it meant you would see me as your enemy." She then revealed the truth behind her greatest crime. "Beatrice told you I sold the company shares to ruin your father," she said, her voice hardening for the first time. "The truth is, I sold them to save his life. The man with the scarred face that Isabella told you about, he came to this house. He sat in that very chair you're sitting in now and told me that your father had 3 days to pay back $500,000, or he would never be seen again. Your father was a wreck, paralyzed by fear. Beatrice refused to help, calling it a lesson he needed to learn. So I did the only thing I could. I sold my personal shares, the ones my own father had left me, and I paid them. I never told Richard. His pride was the only thing he had left. I let him, and everyone else, believe the worst of me to save what little of him remained. The final revelation was the most tragic of all. He was getting better in those last few weeks," she said, a wistful sadness in her voice. "He had finally seen Beatrice for what she was. We were making a plan, you know. We were going to expose her, sell what we could, and leave. Move to California maybe, just the 3 of us. We were going to be a real family, away from all of this poison." She looked away, towards the cold fireplace. He ran out of time. As the last secret was laid bare, the library transformed. It was no longer a cold, silent room in a broken home. It was a council of war. The grief between mother and son did not vanish, but it was forged into something new, a shared, steely resolve. "She can't get away with this," Leo said, his voice low and dangerous. The confused boy was gone, replaced by a man with a clear and singular purpose. "We have to destroy her." "I agree," Eleanor said, her strategic mind, so long dormant, now clicking into place. But we must be smart. Your grandmother is a master of the narrative. If we accuse her publicly, she will twist it. She will paint you as a grief-stricken, unstable son, easily manipulated by his greedy mother. We can't fight her on her terms. We need to create a stage she cannot control and present evidence she cannot deny. The blueprint for justice began to take shape. "I'll call an emergency meeting of the board," Leo said, his mind racing. "Under the guise of presenting my new 5-year strategic plan for the company, they'll all be there. She will be there, sitting in the front row, expecting me to be her perfect puppet." "Good," Eleanor affirmed. "That will be our stage, and I will provide the script." She began to list their assets. "We have your father's secret ledger. We have the original trust documents from Henderson, which prove your father's initial intent. You will go back to Isabella, Leo. Get her to write a sworn, notarized affidavit. Her testimony as an outside party is crucial." She stood and walked to her desk, pulling out a thick folder Leo had never seen before. "And I have this. For years, I kept my own records. Emails your father sent me, voicemails he left me in moments of panic, my own documentation of every threat Beatrice ever made, every asset she moved. I have been preparing for this day for a very long time. For the first time in 5 years, mother and son were a team. They sat together at the great library table, the polished wood reflecting their determined faces. The Cold War that had defined their existence was over. A new, targeted campaign had just been launched. They were no longer just survivors of Beatrice's reign. They were the architects of her downfall. The boardroom of the Davenport Corporation was a temple built to the gods of power and money. It was a cold, sterile space on the 75th floor, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a panoramic, almost arrogant, view of the city below. A colossal mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the grim, serious faces of the dozen board members who had been summoned to this emergency meeting. At the head of the table, in the chair that had once been his father's, sat Leo. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, his face a mask of calm, unreadable composure. To his right, sitting slightly back from the table, was Eleanor. She was a silent, graceful presence, her stillness a stark contrast to the nervous energy in the room. And at the opposite end of the table, in the seat of honor, sat the Queen herself, Beatrice Davenport. She was radiant, dressed in a deep emerald suit, a diamond brooch glittering at her throat. She looked upon the proceedings with a benevolent, proprietary smile. This was her coronation, the day her years of careful planning would finally culminate in the installation of her grandson, her puppet, onto the throne. Leo began the meeting, his voice steady and clear, resonating with a newfound authority that surprised some of the older board members. He spoke of the company's challenges, of the need for a bold, new vision. He thanked the board for their stewardship in the difficult years following his father's death. And then, he turned his gaze to his grandmother. "I especially want to thank the chairwoman emeritus, my grandmother, Beatrice Davenport," he said, his words dripping with a perfect, false sincerity. "Her wisdom and unwavering guidance have been the bedrock upon which this family and this company has stood." Beatrice inclined her head, accepting the tribute as her due. She was positively glowing. "Thank you, Leo," Beatrice said, her voice smooth as silk as she rose to her feet. "Your father would be so proud to see you sitting in his chair today. He built this company on the principles of strength, integrity, and above all, family legacy. It is in the spirit of that legacy that I formally nominate his son, his rightful heir, Leo Davenport, to the position of Chief Executive Officer. I trust this board will vote to secure the future he envisioned." She sat down, her smile triumphant, her victory absolute. The chairman of the board began to speak, calling for the vote, a mere formality. "Mr. Chairman," Leo's voice cut through the room, sharp and cold as breaking glass. "Before we vote, there is one final piece of business to attend to." An uneasy silence fell. Beatrice's smile tightened by a fraction. "We have spoken a great deal this morning about my father's legacy," Leo continued, his eyes sweeping across the room before landing, like a predator's, on his grandmother. I think it's time we all understood what that legacy truly is." He pressed a button on the console in front of him. The massive screen behind him, which had been displaying the Davenport corporate logo, flickered to life. It now showed a scanned page from a ledger, the handwriting elegant but frantic. "This," Leo announced to the stunned room, "is a page from my father's real ledger, the one he kept in a secret office in Queens." Gasps rippled around the table. As you can see, it details not wise investments, but catastrophic gambling losses, financed by a shell corporation called Phoenix Holdings, which was, in turn, funded by millions of dollars siphoned from this very company. "Leo, what is the meaning of this?" Beatrice snapped, her voice losing its silky quality. "This is private family business. This is not the place." "This," Leo interrupted, his voice like ice, "is the business of a corporation whose funds were embezzled to pay for a private addiction. And it gets worse." He clicked the button again. The ledger was replaced by a notarized document. "This is a sworn affidavit from a Miss Isabella Lacrosse. Some of you may remember the rumors. My grandmother here would have you believe Miss Lacrosse was a predator who blackmailed my father." But in her own words, he began to read, his voice devoid of emotion. "Beatrice Davenport was fully aware of my relationship with her son. She encouraged it. She saw me as a necessary distraction to keep Richard occupied while she systematically consolidated her control over the family trusts and corporate assets." "Lies. She is a liar," Beatrice shrieked, half rising from her chair. The mask was beginning to crack. Leo ignored her. Click. A new slide appeared, a timeline. On one side were the dates of Richard's secret stays at addiction rehabilitation clinics, sourced from James Henderson's private records. On the other, the dates of Eleanor's alleged affair and the sale of her shares. "As you can see," Leo said calmly, "my father's gambling addiction was a chronic issue for years before the events my grandmother uses as his excuse. He was not driven to it by betrayal. He was already drowning." Click. Another document. Richard's original marital trust, granting Eleanor absolute control, a testament to his initial, unwavering faith in his wife. The final click revealed the most damning evidence of all, a series of bank statements and transfer authorizations. "And this," Leo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "is a record of my grandmother's personal financial activity. You will notice that on the very same days that my father suffered his largest gambling losses, Beatrice made a series of multi-million-dollar transfers from the company's accounts into trusts that she, and she alone, controlled. She wasn't his savior. She wasn't his guide. She was a vulture, picking at the bones of her own son's self-destruction, using his addiction as the perfect cover for the greatest act of fraud in this company's history." The boardroom was in an uproar. Beatrice was on her feet now, her face a grotesque mask of fury, her regal composure shattered into a million pieces. "You ungrateful brat," she screamed, her voice raw and ugly. "She has poisoned you. That woman," she pointed a trembling, bejeweled finger at Eleanor, "she has twisted your mind. I did everything for your father. I did everything for this family." Her tirade was a confession, a wild, public unraveling that was more convincing than any document on the screen. The board members, men of power and calculation, stared at her, not with sympathy, but with the cold appraisal of a liability being assessed. The Queen was mad. Leo stood tall amidst the chaos he had unleashed. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice cutting through his grandmother's shrieks, "I am withdrawing my name from consideration for the CEO position at this time." He looked directly at Beatrice, whose face had gone pale with shock. "Instead, I make a different motion. I move that this board launch a full, independent forensic investigation into the activities of Beatrice Davenport. I move that all her assets connected to this company be frozen, effective immediately. And I move that she be removed from her position as chairwoman emeritus and from this board, for cause." The chairman, a portly man who was visibly sweating, looked at the damning evidence on the screen, at the ranting, unhinged woman at the end of the table, and at the cold, determined face of her grandson. There was no choice. "All in favor of the motion?" he stammered. One by one, hands went up around the table. It was unanimous. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was like a gunshot. It was over. Beatrice stared at Leo, her eyes wide with the horror of total defeat. She had lost everything. The empire she had schemed for, the legacy she had murdered for, the grandson she had molded. All gone, in the space of 15 minutes. Security guards appeared at the door, their presence a quiet final humiliation. As they escorted her from the room, a disgraced queen being led from her castle, Eleanor and Leo locked eyes across the great, polished table. Nothing needed to be said. The lies were dead. The ghosts were at peace. Justice, cold and absolute, had finally been served. Once the boardroom doors closed behind the disgraced figure of Beatrice Davenport, an unnerving silence descended, thick and heavy as funeral velvet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a wreckage of stunned faces and shattered assumptions. The 12 board members, men who navigated the treacherous waters of Wall Street with cynical ease, looked as if they had just witnessed a public execution. They stared at the empty chair at the end of the table, then at Leo, then at Eleanor, their minds struggling to recalibrate a world that had been turned completely upside down. The power in the room, once so firmly anchored in the iron will of the matriarch, had been ripped from its moorings. It now flowed, silent and potent, to the young man who stood, calm and resolute, at the head of the table. The chairman, a man named George Carlyle, cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Leo, he said, the name now carrying a new weight, a new respect. What now? It was the question on everyone's mind. The company was now a ship in the eye of a hurricane, its legendary founding family exposed as a nest of secrets and lies. This was the moment Leo could have gloated, could have celebrated his victory. He did neither. He stepped fully into the role he had unknowingly been preparing for, not as an heir, but as a leader. Now, Leo said, his voice a steady, commanding baritone, we get to work. We have a company to protect. A full statement will be drafted and sent to our key investors within the hour, assuring them of the board's decisive action and the stability of our operations. A separate memo will be circulated internally, informing our employees that a change in leadership has occurred. We will be transparent, we will be decisive, and we will move forward. He was no longer a son avenging his father. He was a CEO saving his company. Across the room, Eleanor watched him, and for the first time in many years, a look of profound, unburdened pride softened the sorrow in her eyes. The truth, once unleashed, was a relentless force. News of Beatrice Davenport's spectacular fall from grace and the sordid reality of her son's life tore through the insulated world of New York's high society like a shockwave. Phones buzzed with frantic energy from Park Avenue to the Hamptons. The carefully constructed myth of the perfect Davenport dynasty, a myth Beatrice had spent a lifetime cultivating, was annihilated overnight. She became a pariah, a social leper. The invitations stopped. The fawning calls ceased. She was left to rattle around in her cavernous Fifth Avenue apartment, a prisoner in a gilded cage of her own making. Her assets were frozen, her power gone, her name now synonymous with scandal and deceit. She was a queen in exile, with no one left to rule but the bitter ghosts of her own ambition. In the days that followed, the Davenport Tower was a hive of controlled, purposeful activity. Leo and Eleanor worked side by side, a united and formidable force. They were in the office before sunrise and left long after the city lights had begun to glitter. They navigated the treacherous fallout with a calm, surgical precision, rebuilding trust with investors, reassuring employees, and charting a new course for the company. The cold, empty distance that had defined their relationship for so long was gone, replaced by an easy, implicit understanding. They were no longer just mother and son, they were partners, allies who had survived the same war. It was late one evening, nearly a week after the board meeting, that the final, most important reckoning occurred. They were alone in the vast office, the city a silent, sprawling galaxy of light beyond the glass walls. Leo had been staring at a portrait of his father that still hung on the wall, a relic of the lie he had once worshipped. All those years, he said, his voice quiet, directed at his mother, who sat across the desk from him. You knew. You knew what he was really like, what she was doing. You sat at that dinner table, night after night, and you listened to me. You heard every terrible thing I said to you, every accusation I threw at you. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a raw, painful understanding. How did you do it? How did you live with the truth, and with my hatred, for 5 years? Eleanor looked at her son, the man who had emerged from the confused, angry boy, and she finally gave him the last piece of the truth. Because my love for you was always stronger than my need to be right, she said, her voice soft but unwavering. The boy you were then, he needed a hero. You idolized your father, and you trusted your grandmother. If I had told you the truth back then, it would have shattered your world. I would have been taking away the only 2 pillars you felt you had to lean on. And so, I made a choice. I chose to carry the truth alone, so you could carry the illusion. I was willing to be your villain, Leo, if it meant that for a little while longer, you could live in a world that made sense to you. I was simply waiting for the man you are today to be strong enough to survive the truth. Her words settled into the quiet space between them, a revelation of a love so profound, so selfless, it almost defied comprehension. Leo finally understood. Her silence hadn't been weakness. It had been an act of unimaginable strength. Her coldness hadn't been a lack of feeling. It had been a shield, protecting him from a truth she knew would destroy him. She had suffered his scorn, his hatred, his public humiliation, all while secretly saving his father's life and patiently waiting for her son to find his own way out of the darkness. He stood up, walked around the desk, and for the first time since he was a small child, he wrapped his arms around his mother. It was a gesture of profound gratitude, of deep, sorrowful apology, and of a love that had finally, after a long and brutal war, found its way back home. The fall of the matriarch had been a victory, but it was a victory measured in loss and sorrow. Yet here, in this quiet embrace, was the true prize. A family, broken and battered, but finally whole. 6 months passed. The storm that had ripped through the Davenport Corporation and the highest echelons of New York society had subsided, leaving behind a profoundly altered landscape. The name Davenport no longer signified untouchable power and flawless legacy, but something far more complex, a cautionary tale of secrets and survival. Under the joint leadership of Leo and Eleanor, the company had stabilized. Their quiet, efficient partnership was a source of endless fascination and respect. They were not just rebuilding a business, they were performing a public act of healing, demonstrating a unity that was all the more powerful for the brutal public war that had preceded it. The mansion, once a cold and silent museum of grief, had slowly begun to feel like a home again. The oppressive weight of the past had lifted, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding. Beatrice, stripped of her power and her fortune, had vanished from their lives, a disgraced recluse living out her days in a self-imposed exile, consumed by a bitterness no one had any interest in witnessing. She had become a ghost, a footnote in the story she had tried so desperately to write. The war was over, but the scars remained. One cool Saturday afternoon, Leo decided it was finally time to dismantle the last monument to the lie he had lived. He went to his father's private study in the mansion, a room that had been kept exactly as Richard had left it, a perfect, untouched shrine to a man who had never existed. For years, cleaning it out had felt like a sacrilege. Now, it felt like a necessity, a final sweeping away of the ashes. He packed his father's expensive suits for charity, sorted through his collection of ostentatious watches, and began to clear the bookshelves. As he removed a heavy row of leather-bound legal texts, his fingers brushed against a section of the wall that felt different. It was a small, hidden, safe, seamlessly blended into the wood paneling. His heart quickened. After a moment's thought, he entered a date into the keypad, his own birthday. The safe clicked open. Inside, there was no cash, no jewelry, no secret financial documents. There was only a single, thick, cream-colored envelope with one line scrawled on the front in his father's familiar, elegant hand. For my Eleanor. It was a letter Richard had written, but had never had the chance to give her. With trembling hands, Leo sat in his father's chair and began to read. The letter started as a confession, a rambling, desperate apology for his weakness, for his addiction, for the years of pain he had caused. He wrote of his suffocating fear of his own mother, of the prison his life had become. He confessed his deep, abiding love for Eleanor, his awe at her strength, his shame at how he had allowed her to take the blame for his own failings. "You were the only truly strong person in this family," he wrote, "and I was the weakest. I see that now. I am ready to finally be the man you always deserved." He wrote of their plan to escape, to run away to California, a flicker of hope in the dark confession. Then, the tone of the letter changed. The elegant script became a shaky, almost illegible scrawl. "Something is wrong," he had written. "My chest, the pain is back, worse than ever. I called for Mother. She's in the house. I need my pills. They're on the mantel." The next few lines were barely decipherable, the pen strokes digging into the paper like frantic, dying scratches. "She came in. She sees I'm on the floor. I told her. The pills. She is just looking at me. She walked to the mantel. She picked up the bottle. She's looking at it. At me. I can't breathe." Leo's own breath caught in his throat, his blood turning to ice. He read the final, horrifying sentence. "She put the bottle back down. She is just standing there, watching." She said, "Let God's will be done, Richard. The legacy requires a stronger hand. She's watching me die. My God, Eleanor, she is killing me. Oh, Wang." The letter fell from Leo's numb fingers. It was the final, most grotesque secret of all. His father's death was not a suicide born of shame. It was not a tragic, accidental heart attack. It was murder. A quiet, passive, and monstrously cruel execution carried out by a mother upon her own son for the crime of being weak. The full scope of Beatrice's evil was now laid bare, and it was more profound, more absolute than he ever could have imagined. He found Eleanor in the conservatory, tending to her orchids. He didn't say a word. He simply handed her the letter. She read it, her face, as always, a mask of composure. But as she reached the final, terrible lines, the mask did not just crack, it dissolved. For the first time, Leo saw his mother break. A single, silent tear traced a path down her cheek, a drop of salt water falling onto a rare white petal. It was not a tear of shock, but of horrific, final validation. She had known she was married to a weak man and fighting a monster. She just never knew the monster was capable of this. Leo knelt before her, taking her hand, which was cold as marble. All the apologies in the world felt like dust in his mouth. What could he say to a woman who had endured this? A woman who had been the sole guardian of a truth so dark it defied comprehension? He looked at her, at the quiet strength that had absorbed 5 years of his hatred, that had carried the weight of her husband's sins, that had stood firm against the machinations of a murderer, all to protect him. And he finally found the only words that were left. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "for protecting me, from all of it. Thank you." Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured for too long, for beneath it lies not emptiness, but the strength of a love that can withstand any storm, and the patience to wait for the day when justice is finally brought into the light. The war for the Davenport legacy was truly, finally over. What remained was not a tainted empire, but a future, waiting to be built on the hard, solid ground of a terrible, liberating truth. Thank you for listening. Join us next time on Gia Ding US for another story where family ties are tested and secrets refuse to stay buried.